concern ourselves with housing our neighbors, but with protecting our neighborhoods as well.
Thank you, Amy. It looks like we have no more callers for this public comment.
Okay, great. I'm just gonna make sure the live streaming is going. And we'll go. Is there any more public comment, Kayla? No?
No more public comment.
Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen real quick. So here we are. Thank you for meeting once again. Let's walk through this. So next we're gonna go through approval of the minutes. So it would be great if we could get a motion to approve, or if you have any changes to the July, August, and November minutes.
Move to approve the minutes from July, August, and November.
I can second that. This is Kathy.
I see that Sean has his hand raised just before we move to a vote, Susanna.
Okay, go ahead, Sean.
I didn't attend most of those meetings, so I probably shouldn't vote, correct?
It's up to you. So the vote to approve the minutes is sort of a vote of confidence in the minute taker and the membership of the meeting. But if you don't want to,
Okay.
you may abstain.
Fair enough.
Okay, Elizabeth, do we have enough votes if Sean abstains?
I think the vote to approve could be the majority of those who are here could pass it.
Great.
Yeah.
And I'll vote to approve with Elizabeth's explanation.
Great, okay. Yay, we did that. Okay. So recommendations from the last meeting, you made recommendations about temporary shelters, that a temporary shelter needs to be associated with an institutional or public use.
Excuse me, Susanna,
yeah,
did
go
you
ahead.
actually take the vote? We had a
Sorry.
motion and a second, but some discussion, but I also saw Scott had his hand up. I'm just wanting to
I'm
make
sorry.
sure that we did actually take a vote. I know you're not feeling well, so I thought I'd sort of jump in.
Sorry, thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I was absent from the August 18th meeting, so I was gonna abstain from that one. I didn't go back and look at the recording, but I would vote to approve the others. So not sure if you're gonna break it out or not.
Kayla, do you want to call for the vote for each of the minutes?
Yeah, we can do it separate. Except I think, Elizabeth, we would need a motion per minute, correct?
If you want to vote for them each individually, yes, let's do a motion for each month.
I withdraw my previous motion and move to approve the July minutes.
And I'll move to remove my previous second, and I'll second the, wait, was it July? Are we doing July? July, yes, sorry.
Okay, do we have a approval from everyone for the July minutes? Perfect, motion passes. All right, so do we have a motion for the August?
So moved.
So seconded.
All right, all those in favor? Okay,
Move to approve the November minutes.
So seconded.
all right, do we have a full approval for those minutes? Perfect. Okay, and Scott, just to make sure you were not approving the August, correct? Or you were abstaining?
Yeah, I was abstaining.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. I appreciate your help today.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So let's go back to our progress from the last meeting. Let's see. So as I was saying, for temporary shelters, you recommended that within residential zoning districts, that the temporary shelter needs to be associated with an institutional or a public use. Hardship shelters, we changed the the term to hardship housing and change the time recommendation from a year to 6 months with the ability to renew 3 times. The public improvement standards, we're going to go through those in detail a little more thoroughly, because when we started kind of reviewing that as staff internally, we had some questions for you. So we'll talk about that in a minute. And then let's see, I'm having trouble seeing. Okay. Let's see. And you were okay with the rest of the code language, with the exception of Sean, because of the hardship housing provisions. And then today we just are going to ask for additional guidance on overlay districts, master plan areas, and then fine tuning the public improvement requirements. So for overlay districts, and I might ask Pauline to jump in, or Colin, we have a number of overlay districts within the city, and these are kind of an additional provision over the existing zoning district. I'm not sure if I'm describing that right. So Pauline or Colin, if you want to jump in, that'd be great. We have Northwest Crossing Overlay District, the Dean Swift Refinement Plan, Medical District Overlay, Murphy Crossing Refinement Plan Overlay District, the COCC Overlay District, and the Juniper Ridge Overlay Districts. So Colin or Pauline, do you want to elaborate on what those mean, the different requirements for each of those?
I can. Good morning, everybody. So as Susanna said, we have these overlay districts, and the ones on the screen here, I'd say almost all of them have their own use tables within their overlay district. So as you can imagine, COCC is focused on college type uses, and Juniper Ridge is focused on the employment type uses. And we went ahead with the citywide code updates and updated all the use tables to add shelters to almost all the use tables, or zones, I should say, except for that heavy industrial zone. Well, then we started looking at these overlay districts, and you'll see on the next slide, very similar with the master plan districts, that a lot of these use tables don't mention shelter uses. And so the question, I believe, is whether or not we want to add shelters to all these overlay districts, because they're not currently listed as a use. I think you're muted, Susanna.
See, Kathy has her hand up. Go ahead, Kathy.
Yeah, I would like to see this. To me, it's an issue of equity, and we don't want Northwest Crossing to not be a possible location. And I live very close to the Dean Swift Refinement Plan, and I think it would be fine to be there. So and especially if we're looking at, different areas of the city, we should be able to look at all areas of the city so that everyone has an opportunity to participate in addressing the need, and that no one feels that, well, you're dumping everything on me and nobody's over there, whatever. It only exacerbates those issues for people if we've carved out areas that we can't do this. And so I would think that it would be best to allow it in all of these zones.
Let me stop sharing for a sec. Anyone else have input they'd like to give on that? Thanks, Kathy. Scott?
Yeah. I guess I was just kind of wondering how that gets implemented, where, we specify some of these requirements based on RS and RM, and if an overlay district has something that's kind of separate from that, how do we quantify those kind of specific development code applications that don't really find a home within an overlay district that has just a different kind of residential zoning, let's say?
So Scott, I went through all of them already to look at exactly how we would be able to add them to their use tables. And a lot of them are already broken down by zones. So those are very simple. Bend Central District, for example, has them broken down by zones. So does Northwest Crossings. And so unless there was that heavy industrial zone, we would put them permitted in all their other zones. And then the other and more often in the master plans where they create maybe a unique residential zone, as long as it's residential, we would say it's permitted just because we've allowed it in every residential zone in the city.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was wondering, of kind of that unique, if they say live work or something like that, how this development code update interacts with those kind of specific master plan zones.
Right, and COCC is a good example because they're broken down into different types of districts, but we just put them as permitted in those districts.
And then Scott, I would also say, unless overridden by the specifics of the shelter code, the other standards of a master plan area, for example, would continue to apply. So if there's design review, for example, or any of the special elements incorporated into the master plan, unless overridden by the code you all have worked on, those would still apply if a shelter goes to locate in one of these overlay or master plan areas.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's a concern is could there be any language in a master plan or an overlay zone that would prevent some of these developments without actually saying you can't have these developments, like some sort of caveat, and maybe we're getting into the weeds, but and maybe we'll have to kind of do this round of development code updates and see what happens. And if there are people or if there are things that are skirting the code or doing that, then maybe that's the time to address it.
I mean, I think, those design standards or some of the other master plan or overlay zone standards could make it more expensive to build a new building in one area versus another. So that could be prohibitive. That's true for any kind of development, I think. And then if there have been CC&Rs that have been adopted, again, with higher design review standards or others, one type of shelter may be more difficult or not able to be located in one area versus another, again, consistent with other types of development as well.
Yeah. And CC&Rs can be enacted after this passes, right, to restrict? Isn't that?
That's right. Generally, the city code doesn't sort of interact with CC&Rs. Those are private agreements. And the only time we've seen legislation override CC&Rs or prevent certain provisions in future CC&Rs has come from the legislature.
Okay, thanks, Scott. Kathy, do you have another question?
Yeah, thank you, Scott, for bringing that up. I would be very concerned about design review being used as a weapon. I've experienced it personally in many circumstances that it's used to stop whatever it is that is proposed. Now, I've worked in more extreme locations and Bend is more friendly than many, but it just seems to me that the certain types of shelters that we're talking about should not be subject at all to design review. And I'm just not sure how that could be addressed, but clearly it could be used to stop any development. I think we need to address that particular issue. I'd like to hear what Pauline has to say about that. If there's an option to exempt the kinds of shelters that we're talking about from design review within these overlay districts.
We could definitely look at going through each of the sections or the different master plans and overlay districts and exempt them from design reviews. I mean, that's one example that Elizabeth provided on the uniqueness that may happen in one of these types of areas. Juniper Ridge, has and I'm not real familiar with Juniper Ridge, but a lot of focus on trip caps and transportation studies that applies to all development. So certain things I think we can look at exempting. Certain things are in the code and cannot be changed. But I believe design review, if there is interest from the committee as a whole to not have design review apply, then I could go through each of them and exempt it. Or just under the shelter code, just simply state design review does not apply to shelters.
How does everyone feel about that? Should we make a motion and vote on a recommendation?
Well, I'm happy to move that shelters should not be subjected to design review in any of the districts that would otherwise require design review.
Mary, you popped in.
Well, I have a little bit of a concern about, it's one thing to add a use to an overlay and to things that are being master planned, but we don't have, so I haven't gone back, Pauline, I don't know if you have, but when you start to amend overlays, like what kind of amendment are we doing to an overlay zone without the actual developer here? The kind of process that we're doing. I mean, I just haven't looked at it that carefully. When you say, oh, for this kind of use, there's no more design review, you could do that to any use without the applicant. It just makes me a little bit concerned that we have no notice about a change that they might want to comment on. And the type of review that you normally would do. And I don't know, I mean, there may be existing CC&Rs for some of these various areas, you know, just to go in. I've been involved before with amending overlays, just fairly minor ones, and they were pretty big processes. And we worked a lot with the applicant and their attorney. I don't know, Colin, what you think about it.
Well, a couple of things. I mean, there's kind of a distinction between an overlay that the city did over many multiple, even hundreds of properties legislatively over, as opposed to a master plan that was done by a developer for a small group of properties that then over the years is subdivided and then transferred to new property owners. So take Northwest Crossing, the older portion, for example. You know, that was just one developer who had a lot of control over what was happening in that property for many years. But now it's all sold to hundreds and hundreds of new owners, and the developer's sort of stepping away.
Right.
And so I would look at that a little bit differently than, say, the newer part of Northwest Crossing, or say Petrosa on the east side, where the developer is still very strongly involved because they have a lot of development left to do, and they're still marketing product to the future residents of that. And I mean, for each of those, there's still a fairly high level of control that the original developer maintains through CC&Rs. And so we could put either uses or design standards in there that the city regulates that may or may not be more restrictive than what the owner has. In fact, just not, I mean, taking shelters, you know, out of the discussion, we usually take our city design standards out. We don't require our normal city commercial or multifamily residential design standards. We don't apply those in these sort of newer master plan areas because we know that the developer has their own vision for what they want the properties to look like. And in many instances, they'll be more restrictive than what the city would require. And so we don't require a developer to, or construction that's being built in those to go through our fairly meager design standards and then have more significant design standards that are imposed by the developer. And so I guess I'm kind of rambling on here, but I think what we could do, I don't foresee applying design standards or removing design standards for particular uses to be that inconsistent than doing them citywide as opposed to doing it within the overlay zones. Because if the developer has a concern, more than likely they still have control over what happens in there. If they haven't, if they've sort of turned it over, if they've moved on to other things and it's now just the residents, I don't see that as a whole lot different than just being outside of an overlay zone or a master plan area and just being part of the community and having the same regulations as everybody else.
Okay, that makes sense.
So I guess my question, I mean, just quickly looking at, like, Juniper Ridge has fence standards. So when we're talking about design standards, are we talking about going in each of these and taking out all types of those types of standards too. I would need some clarification on that because that's a big change. And then, the Bend Central, not so much a Bend Central district, but the recently adopted one, which had a big community process. I'm drawing a blank. Damien had the
Southeast area plan or
yes. Yeah, Southeast area plan, which was a big community committee. I mean, Colin, are you thinking that's like the same thing as like the Northwest Crossings or the Petrosa? Because that's an area plan. I just need some clarification if we go ahead with a change like this.
Well, I guess it's my, or at least thought or understanding that this would apply to like the building design standards for the actual building and not like go just ripple through the entire site. That would be pretty, having to go through each and every overlay or area plan or master plan or refinement plan and trying to decide which development standards apply or not. It would be quite difficult. So I was hopeful that this was just pertaining to the actual like facade of the structure is what we usually look at for design standards. But if that's the case, I would say somewhat agree with Kathy. I mean, it seems like this should be applied equitably across the entire community rather than trying to pick certain areas where it applies and certain areas where it doesn't. As at least from how the city regulates. And if there are private controls on that, then there's private controls. But if we're not applying it in the generic residential zoning districts, then why should it apply from a city regulation within the overlay zones?
Anyone else have any questions or clarifications on that?
I guess I'd still propose can you hear me? Scott said my voice was not very loud.
Yeah, if you can speak up, that would be great.
Okay, I still stand by my proposal, but I didn't hear a second, so it may die with lack of a second, but I really feel it's a matter of equity across the whole city.
Catherine, can you please repeat your proposal one more time?
Is it better without my headphones? Can you hear me? Okay, sorry, they're defective, I guess. I'm proposing that we eliminate the requirement for design review in the overlay districts to our any of the kinds of shelters that we proposed, and so that it's equal to every place else in the city, the approach.
Any discussion or, yeah, go ahead, Dana.
Nobody wants to second that?
I would like to second that.
I almost feel like I guess I don't know what repercussions this is going to have. I haven't really thought about how taking the design standards for these out of the overlay zones. So, and then master plans as well, or, I mean, I guess I'm kind of hesitant to do that.
I agree. Like, I don't really know enough about zones or overlay, but I agree with the notion of equity. So that's my basis for a motion or seconding, sorry.
I think it'd be nice to have some examples of how this would apply, kind of thing. Because it seems like it's getting tendrils that are getting way deep into the code and very specific places. And
So maybe one example would be, because since we're all familiar with the Bend Central District, I believe that's an overlay. And there are design standards for the Bend Central District that talk about buildings fronting streets and, some window percentages, having the entrance oriented to the street, the parking lots are in the back. I don't know that the parking lot location is actually a design standard. I'd have to look at that, but that's how all buildings are treated in the Bend Central District. we would say shelters would not have to follow those possibly. I see Colin raising his hand though.
Well, I think there needs to be a distinction between design standards and siting standards, where, you know, if the idea is to remove cost, and if people believe that having certain materials or certain amount of glazing on a facade is in too much of an imposition for these types of uses, then that's one thing. But I think whether the building is set back or set forward on the property is a little bit different, because that's not going to impact the cost of construction relative to, like because of materials or that type of thing. But it could have immense repercussions on the streetscape and what we're trying to achieve as a community for these types of specific overlays that are created to have a more urban type of feel. So I guess my point is that I think there should be a distinction between what we consider to be the architectural design standards and then sort of on-site siting standards.
Yeah, that's kind of my concern.
Yeah,
we just went through these processes and we don't have the people and the staff and that went through them to talk to you about the intent and whether there would be a cost difference or a policy difference that could even undermine the community support for shelters. Because all of a sudden shelters don't have to follow what everybody else is following. And yeah.
So part of my concern is that nobody else is having to do the design review in the rest of the city. So why do they have to do it in these overlay zones? Now, it may be that a temporary use is treated differently than a permanent structure. But my experience in other cities is that if a community does not want to have something happen, they can use the design review process to ask for redesign after redesign after redesign, and it can drag things out a year or two, and then the opportunity is missed. And I'm not saying that that's going to happen in Bend, but I've seen it happen in multiple other cities. And I think it's going to be a weapon that will be used to stop a shelter from being built in some of these communities, and I don't want to see that happen. And if other communities don't have the ability to impose that, I think it's a matter of equity.
So, sorry to jump in again, but I think it would be unusual to have a design review be a tipping point for opposition for one of these. I mean, I'm not certain about how that works in other jurisdictions where it may be highly discretionary, where a large body of decision makers, perhaps these things have to go to like an architectural review committee that is publicly supported and maybe council appointed or elected. That's not what happens here. These are sort of more, administrative types of reviews that are wrapped into the land use decision that we still have to make the decision in 120 days. It has all kinds of protocols for when we need to issue these types of decisions. And while, yeah, we'd be looking at things a little bit differently as far as like the architecture, I don't foresee it as being either, if it's there or if it's not there, it doesn't affect the timelines any more than requiring a sewer and water analysis or a transportation analysis.
But Colin, does the Northwest Crossing not have their own design review?
They do through their architectural review committee, but if you're looking at like the Bend Central District, they don't. That would be all through the city.
Yeah, and in that case, I would agree with you. It's not an issue. It's where an area has appointed their own design review committee.
Well, then like for example, the Northwest Crossings or the Petrosas or these sort of developer-initiated master plans, we defer to them. We've removed, and Pauline can jump in if I'm wrong, but we've essentially said that the design review, the architectural design review, elements of the development code that would apply elsewhere, if there wasn't a master plan, don't apply here, because we understand that there is an architectural review committee, a private one that's appointed by the developer, that does that, and they're much more restrictive than what the city would require. And so we do remove that from the master plan areas. And I know it's confusing, but there's kind of some distinction between these master plan areas that were initiated by a developer. They owned the property, they owned it all. That's different than sort of these sort of legislative efforts that were taken on by the city to put different regulations over multiple property owners where the owners were not applicants, like the downtown or the Bend Central District is a great example. Dean Swift Refinement Plan, the Lava Ridge Refinement Plan, those are areas, Dean Swift or Murphy Crossing. Those were areas where there were multiple property owners that the city does retain architectural review within those areas, because there is no private developer who's doing that.
And I would just say, Kathy, that, in the areas where there is a private design review committee, like Colin is talking about, I'm assuming those generally come with CC&Rs. So right. If we remove design review from the code, those CC&R design reviews committees would still apply. So removing it from the code doesn't get at what is otherwise required by those private agreements.
Thank you for the clarification. I'm not sure if my motion makes sense given that. I am concerned with things like private design review, building design review happening in these areas and being used to basically drag out the process so that a provider will back away. And I could foresee that happening. But if what you're telling me is that we really have no way of waiving that, then it's pointless. But I'm just raising it as a concern. And if there's something that we can do to address that concern and provide equity across the entire city, I'd like to see us do that. If you're telling me that that's not really a possibility, then I will remove my motion.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to get these in place and see how things play out, and then revisit as time goes on. So does anyone else? Barb, go ahead.
This is one probably for Mary Alice. What if it were instead of shall be, what if it's may? These may be exempted from design review instead of they shall be exempt from design review. Does that get us anywhere? Does that, yeah. It's the only idea I have. And it's early.
Yeah. I mean, I think that might just create some ambiguity for planning department on what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, you can't, I mean, just from a code writing perspective, the word may is not very helpful.
Sure.
Yeah.
So it's, the codes, we're not advisory.
Right.
So it needs to be must or really.
I mean, Colin raises a good point. When the city has historically, when I think of design review, I think of more, as he was talking about, building facades. Like a lot of cities have really fairly strict design review on the look they want for their city. I mean, Northwest Crossing is classic. All the houses kind of look somewhat similar because of their architectural design review. I moved here from a city where all the houses look different and have different colors, which I really like. Bend's very homogeneous in the way we build. And I'm like, could somebody, and I built a net zero house in Northwest Crossing. So I'm very familiar with the architectural review, and it's nuts. You have to post like what you want to do. And honestly, I hate it the way we do it in Bend because we look too similar, but it's what, and I think of that as design review, not what, like, I feel like BCD and the Southeast area is a more modern way of planning where we're actually trying to have better cities that are walkable and have more streetscapes. And that's like something we've done that's a little more innovative. And I wouldn't want to see that undermined a little. And I don't think of that as design review so much as like site planning, to not have buildings up to the sidewalk and to have better entryways. And so that's what makes me a little nervous about, and I don't really call that design review, and I'd have to look at the code again to see if we called that. I think of that more as site planning than designing review, like what we do in Northwest, what Northwest Crossing does, or that kind of building facades. I mean, we all seen those cities that they look Southwestern, or they look whatever look they want to achieve.
And I think looking, sorry, go ahead, Councilor Campbell.
Oh, thank you, Elizabeth. I'm sorry. So I guess the part that is confusing me is that, my understanding of the shelters that we are talking about, they would never meet any design architectural type review anywhere. We're talking, even if we're talking about a veterans village, which I consider to be, really up there as far as well built and it looks nice. But, I think just that manufactured structure might not be allowed in a lot of places. So as far as that goes, I completely agree with Kathy. We not only should we not do it, I just can't even get my brain around how we would or could, or why it would be different in one place than any other, when it seems to me the whole thing we're doing here is writing code for things that don't right now, don't traditionally fit, if you will, within our traditional code. Does that make sense? So, from the equity point, I'm with Kathy entirely, but, from the legal point of what is this actually going to do for us? Is it going to make anything easier for someone trying to establish a shelter, or is it only going to make things more difficult for our own planners, reviewers, which is the opposite of what we want. The whole thing is we're trying for removing barriers. So there you go. I'm sure none of that was helpful whatsoever, but I said some words.
No, I think it was. I think this is all good input. And I'm wondering, Scott, I see your hand up. If we should dig into... Yeah, go ahead.
I was just wondering if we have any other precedents of types of developments where design standards are waived. Because I was thinking about, I know that I worked on a project up in Northwest Crossing that was affordable housing, and that had to go through. And it changed the building a little bit. We weren't able to do the colors we wanted, but things like that. I was just wondering if there's any other developments that have tried this before at Bend.
Well, as I said, the places where we have eliminated the city's design or architectural design review are areas like Northwest Crossing or Petrosa, where we know that the developer does it. And so if you went through it at Northwest Crossing, it wasn't through the city's design review, it was through the Northwest Crossing ARC. And I guess sort of following up on Barb's comments and I guess I should understand this more. Kathy, is your proposal to be for these permanent structures like new construction for the group shelters or the multi-room shelters, or is it for everything across the board?
It was for everything across the board. I would entertain a revision to that if it seems more palatable to folks, that if it's a permanent structure, it could still be a part of that design review process. But if it's more temporary, or even like Veterans Village is probably going to be permanent, but it's designed to be temporary. The foundations can be lifted. I mean, the buildings can be lifted off the foundations and removed. So technically it's temporary. My concern is that, you know, there might be an opportunity for a shelter to exist for a year or two someplace in these places, but that they'll be delayed and stopped because of meeting certain design review standards that they, as Barb says, they can't possibly meet.
Yeah.
And so that's my concern. How we get there to resolve that issue, I'm open to. I'm just bringing it up as something I could foresee causing a real problem.
I mean, I would just comment that Barb's probably right, that something like a managed camp is not going to be able to meet just what our design standards that we would typically think of as being a office building or commercial building or residential building, like permanent brand new construction. It's going to be kind of different. So I think there could be some distinction between the two as far as the regulatory environment that they are reviewed under. So I think that might make some sense.
Kathy, is one option, it sounds like you're talking about a distinction between the multi-room and group shelters, which may be in a more permanent building, and the outdoor shelters. So is one option potentially to exempt the outdoor shelters, but keep the design review because those are for multi-room and group shelters, because those are housed in more traditional full-scale buildings?
I would be okay with that. I mean, I think that it makes sense. And thank you, Elizabeth, for offering that option up. I would like to modify my motion for exempting outdoor and temporary shelters from design review in these districts, but keeping the requirements for permanent structures in place.
Second.
Everyone, discussion or vote on the motion? I guess I'm not great at these voting things. So let's see, should we call to a vote, and let's make sure we understand. So
And Pauline has her virtual hand up.
thank you.
Of course.
So just to get some clarification, I know we're talking about overlay zones and we're going to move on to master plans next. Citywide, we do have design standards in our commercial and mixed use districts. So if we're focusing on just exempting outdoor shelters from design standards in general, that might be something to think about, because if we're not going to apply it in master plans and overlay zones, I'm not sure why we would apply it in our commercial and mixed use zones.
I would like it to be removed from all zones personally. I mean, it just seems like such a barrier or potential barrier. And I really do feel it's a matter of equity. And thank you, Pauline, for bringing that up. I guess, I mean, we've built into our recommendations certain things about, you know, hiding trash and providing fencing in some locations. I mean, I think we've addressed concerns within the language that we've developed so that it would be okay to eliminate it in the commercial and industrial areas as well. But it's getting very complicated, and I probably should pull back my motion and help me craft an appropriate motion, Pauline, perhaps, that addresses, you know, more than I do about where this might impact. So
Leave that one to the attorneys. But
well, you understand my goal. I'm trying
Yes.
to remove barriers.
Design standards.
Design standards that could be used as barriers for these temporary types of outdoor shelters. So how do we best do that? And we'll leave alone the permanent buildings for, you know, let them be whatever they have to meet. But for the temporary and the outdoor shelters, I really think we need to remove barriers.
So I would say temporary, we don't even have to worry about, or that, you know, that type of shelter, because it's temporary, it's 180 days. So this would be focusing on the outdoor shelters only.
Outdoor shelters, yes.
Yes, and exempting outdoor shelters from design review. And I would write it, and I'm looking to Colin and Mary and Elizabeth, similar to how I write it in the master plans where we exempt them from design review. I mean, obviously the master plans have a arc of some sort that does do the design review, but we would just simply exempt them from design standards
The cities.
of the underlying zone.
Mary, you're muted.
Again, are you talking about structures or are we talking about the site? I mean, we talked to the community about how we will have fencing, we will have safety. So are we saying that there is no review whatsoever about what that looks like?
I would say it's architectural design.
Right.
Or
So in the
just
mixed use,
architectural design.
right, the mixed use MU and MN districts have a window percentage. That to me would be an architectural design that would go away. And then in the commercial chapter, there is, you know, if the building's so long, well, we wouldn't have buildings in this one. I haven't looked through it close enough, but I would understand it to apply to the structure, that type of architectural design.
Is there a good delineation? I'm trying to think between what would be architectural and what would be site. I'm just wondering if there's any kind of fuzzy overlap that's off the top of anyone's head they can think about.
Well, I mean, just the way it works is the architectural design is the actual building. It doesn't apply to the site. There's other site design standards or site review standards, Mary.
And a lot of times in the code, we'll say for purposes of this section. So in the outdoor shelter section, we could say for purposes of this section, architectural design standards don't apply. And this means, you know, and we could go into a little bit more detail to clarify what we're talking about in that particular section.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about master plans as well, because when I go through code review for buildings and trying to figure out what we can put on a piece of land, I generally don't parse out building and site because it's both of them are applicable. So I'm trying to remember trying to think if there's any of these master plan areas that might not delineate that as clean cut, I guess. You know, when you're talking about setbacks and awnings and open areas and things that where there might be a little fuzzy area between what's site and what's building.
Sorry, just Stacy's been trying to raise her hand. And say something.
No, I wanted to add a comment, and I want to, I guess, preface this comment by saying this is not my area of expertise in codes. And I agree with Kathy and the equity question. The only thing that I'll bring in kind of as a novice on this is I want to be careful that if we make these changes, that it's not perceived by the community at large that we are actually not being equitable, that we are asking that shelters get special privileges, because my concern is, will that then be perceived as even a bigger barrier? Are they going to be kind of fighting against it more if it's not a unified, consistent design review? And it's just a question that I get concerned, because I think we're going to meet with a lot of barriers from the community, no matter what we do, just in terms of what we're trying to accomplish. And I want to make sure that this doesn't backfire on us and in some way create more barriers.
That I think that's a good point. So we're at 5 to 10 and we were supposed to end at 10. So obviously not going to do that. And I know Stacy has to leave. So at some point, so
I was actually able to switch my inmate visit to this afternoon. So thank you.
Okay. Great. So just a time check. Can folks stay a bit longer? I don't want to labor this, to death, but this is important stuff. Okay. So what do folks think? Are people ready to make a recommendation on this, or is this something we should investigate more and bring back to the Planning Commission when we go for a work session with them in January on the overlay districts and master plans?
Susanna, your voice goes in and out too. You might have
sorry.
the same problem I have. I don't know.
Is this something that we want to just hold off and have the Planning Commission talk about in January? Or does the sounding board feel comfortable making a recommendation on overlay districts and master plans. Sean, go ahead.
I don't think you're going to be able to get me up to speed in the next hour. I mean, Scott and a lot of Scott's questions are so over my head. I'm trying to do research on my phone while you guys are talking. I just don't think I'm going to be able to get to a point where I can make a decent recommendation or vote. And Scott's not the only one that's brought up very good points, but I don't think I'm going to get there, to answer your question.
Okay. Megan or Barb, do you have any input on this?
I'm tending to think planning commission. That's where I'm leaning.
Okay.
Thanks.
So I just, Susanna,
Give it all to Scott.
Put it off on them.
Susanna, you may have been about to ask this question, but is the sounding board recommending the planning commission decide both issues, whether these should be allowed in master plan and overlay zones, and whether there should be design review standards or not? Or is the sounding board wanting to recommend these are allowed in master plan and overlay zones and ask the planning commission to answer the design review question?
I personally want it to be us to make a recommendation that they be in these zones, but I totally understand the issue of letting planning commission hash out the design review aspect of it.
Yeah, I think that I would agree with Kathy. Allowing them in all the zones, I think it's overlay zones. I think that's great. I think that's consistent with what we've been talking about throughout this whole process. The design review standards just seems kind of like a big change right at the very end. And we haven't I think that's going to be perceived as something that was pretty large that comes in and that we haven't had as much back and forth on it. So I'd be hesitant to make that change today.
Sean, you have your hand up? Oh, okay. It was from before. So should we move for a vote on just, Scott, what you just sort of summarized? The uses are allowed in the overlay districts and the master plan areas, but that we have the planning commission make a recommendation on the actual design standards. I think that's what I heard.
Yeah. And then that could give maybe staff a little time for if there's an example or kind of the more specifics to bring to the planning commission, we could have precedents or examples to talk about.
Yeah, and then we can do some outreach to the development community as well. So before planning commission.
Just for clarification, are we talking about design standards only for outdoor shelters? Just so I know what to prepare for the planning commission.
Yes.
Okay, so just for the minutes, Scott, are you making the motion that Susanna summarized?
Yes.
Is there a second, or does anybody need that restated?
I'll second.
Oh,
Kathy, you second.
I defer to Megan.
Okay, so a motion from Scott and a second from Councilor Perkins. Is there any other discussion, or does anyone want the motion restated? Okay.
So I guess we should vote. Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, Sean? Thumbs up. Okay, Kathy? Thumbs up. Dana? Thumbs up. Scott? Thumbs up. Megan? And Stacy? Thumbs up. Thumbs up. Barb? Thumbs up. Great. Okay. All right. Motion passes. So if folks can stay another 10 minutes, we could walk through. I'm always overly optimistic on these time things, but we could walk through the public improvement standard questions we've got for you. And I'm going to go back and share my screen. Let's see. Okay, let me move down. Okay, and I'm going to hand it off probably to Pauline and Colin to talk about this. This has to do with improvements that developments need to make to accommodate pedestrian circulation off of their site. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Pauline.
Thank you, Susanna. So we just wanted to go over the public improvements that came out of the last zoning board meeting. And it's my understanding the public improvements are transportation, water, and sewer improvements. And Elizabeth and Colin or Russ or Susanna, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my understanding. And when we talk about outdoor shelters, the recommendation from the sounding board was to waive all improvements for sounding board. So water, sewer, transportation improvements. And the city staff after that meeting did start discussing that recommendation from the sounding board. There were some concerns with that particular recommendation, as was some concerns with trying to draft for the other types of shelters, the group and multi-room shelters, a type of financial hardship waiver that an applicant could apply for to waive the improvement standard. So a little bit different. Outdoor shelters, a recommendation from the sounding board was to exempt them outright. And then with the group and multi-room shelters from the sounding board was to create a financial hardship waiver for improvements depending on the cost. And so staff again met with that and had some concerns. When that one's a little bit difficult to draft. And then in general, waiving public improvements for safety is a concern. And I'll look to Colin or Russ if they have any good examples of what concern of a particular development example that could pose concerns if we waive all the improvements.
I can hop in. So good morning, everybody. For those that I haven't met, my name is Russ Grace, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the city. But prior to this, I was the Community Development Director, and prior to that, I was a city engineer. So I have a lot of background on this. Let's start with the kind of outdoor shelters as an example. One of the things that we've been talking about is we do feel like, you know, sidewalk improvements to these type of facilities, if there is sidewalk close to them, is a good idea. Just because how a lot of people will be accessing the site. We understand like using Veterans Village as an example, we did waive street frontage improvements and things like that you would normally see in a standard development. But from a staff perspective, we thought trying to get at least sidewalks in there was a good idea. And then also, if one of these outdoor shelters wants to have water and sewer provided to them, if there's a utility extension needed to reach the property, whether like the water and sewer is not at their front door, we are recommending that if they want to build utilities, they at least have to build them to city standards to their front door to provide service. We're not going to require them to extend it all the way through their property like we would other properties. But if they do want to have, we don't want to have, 100 feet of a 1-inch copper line running down the right of way to get to an existing water line. So there's a couple standards out there that we would like to include, but we just wanted to bring back our recommendation from what we've seen. If you have sidewalk adjacent to you, we feel like it's probably appropriate to extend sidewalk to your site and provide a better accessibility to your site. Flipping to the more permanent shelters like Bethlehem Inn and things like that, we're trying to find a way to look at financial hardships and what that criteria would be. Just so everyone knows, like Bethlehem Inn, we did make them do full street frontage improvements because that was a significant project, more like in a standard development where they actually had a building that was in some right of way that needed to be dedicated, and they had to remove it and build back curb and sidewalks. So I know that's a lot of information. It's kind of technical, but we just wanted to bring back. I know Kathy has her hand up. We just had some things we wanted to raise with the sounding board and where staff was when looking at these proposals.
Yeah, I think Kathy was first and then Barb.
Yeah, I understand the need to bring sewer and water up to the site to meet city standards. I really don't have an issue with that. I would think there'd be an opportunity for grants or something to help with that. My question is for the outdoor shelters and sidewalks, if it's an option to use a asphalt path perhaps instead of full concrete sidewalk, that can make a big difference in terms of cost, but still provide a safe path of travel for pedestrians. And so if we were going to require them to provide a sidewalk, I'd like to see there be an option for an alternative standard that meets safety requirements but may save the development a significant amount of money. So just want to put that out there for that.
Yeah, Kathy, we already have a provision to allow for asphalt in lieu of concrete. I need to go back and look at that standard if that's kind of where one of the recommendations of this board is going, just to make sure there's not a conflict with. We might already have it in the code, just so you know.
And Kathy, I would just also say if there's existing sidewalks on like either side under the ADA, you'd want the same connection for walkable paths. So it just might depend on the site, on whether you could have asphalt or not, and what's there. Like for infill, we tend to want the same just for the ADA reasons. But if nothing is there, I think we do have the ability to have alternate construction. It just kind of depend.
So Mary, an asphalt path can meet ADA, just so you know. I think the notion of doing something that's on a temporary basis, an asphalt sidewalk, is pretty easy to get rid of later for future development. And is a lot more affordable for the providers.
Yeah, it just, if we set up a fund and we're able to just have, I mean, we're trying to get sidewalks everywhere in the city. Yeah. So if we actually had a fund and there were sidewalks on either side, we just might want to construct it. But you're right, if it was temporary and that was faster, that might be the way to go, to just get it up and running.
And we do have some discretion with the city engineer with waivers to standards. The hard thing is trying to figure out how to write a code that can kind of work at 9th Street or 3rd Street or somewhere else, because what's coming to your front door is different depending on where you are in the city.
And for clarification for this group, because many of you may not know, but if the project goes through what we call minimum development standards review and it's in a commercial zone or even residential for that matter, sidewalks are only required if there's sidewalks within 600 feet of the project site. So if there's no sidewalks, we're not going to require them at all. And then if they have to go through like a new building or a brand new outdoor shelter and they're going through what we call site plan review, then sidewalks are required regardless if there's sidewalks within 600 feet because it's a new development.
Okay, Barb, and then Scott.
Thank you. Thanks, Russ. Thanks, Pauline. So I'm thinking about where sidewalks can really be cost prohibitive is corner lot. And so I'm wondering about the difference between saying you've got to make that connection to have access to your site versus you've got to install all of the sidewalks that would be required on the property. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm just thinking through how we would regulate that through code, but I understand what you're saying. Yeah, for me, it's more, if we're on a street and we have connecting sidewalks and it's connected to transit and other things, we want to provide, a good accessible route to the front door of that facility. That's basically what we're trying to say, just so people aren't going on concrete sidewalks and then they're on dirt or gravel, especially within the right of way. Right.
And I completely understand if there's sidewalk on either side, but I'm thinking of something that's kind of at the end of the, of a block and you've come to that corner. Okay, you got to get, like we said, to your front door. We've got to get people in and out of this facility. Thank you. Thank you.
Scott? Thanks, Barb.
I'm forgetting from the slide earlier, did we have kind of a financial hardship exception for sidewalks? Was that?
Yeah, so let me go back to the share screen. So we looked at what other places have done. Portland has an exemption for if, can you see that? Yeah, okay. So Portland has kind of a threshold. If your site improvements are less than 300,000, you're not required to do public improvements. So that's something we could consider. We also have a requirement in the code, and Russ, I'm going to get this wrong, but 25% of the project cost needs to go to ADA improvements. Is that right?
That's coming out of the building code. It's not in our development code, but any building permit, there is a certain percentage of whatever that valuation of construction is they have, and Scott, I think it is 25%, that you have to apply up to 25%, of that valuation cost towards ADA upgrades on the private side of the lot.
But we, internally, we kind of thought we might recommend what Portland did, the 300,000 threshold, but then, we really do want to get sidewalks citywide and feel like it's really important. And many of the people that are going to be using the shelters are maybe in wheelchairs and things like that. So we thought we could have the developer construct the infrastructure as part of the land use decision, but establish a fund, and this would take, need council direction to do so. But there would be an ability to apply for public funding for the improvements for permanent shelters over 180 days. So not for the temporary ones, but for the permanent ones. And so that's a recommendation I think we wanted to discuss with you all about doing, still requiring the minimum amount of improvements because we think they're important, but we need to establish a fund. So does that make sense, Mary or Elizabeth or Pauline? If you want to add anything else, go for it.
I was just going to add, so I guess my reason for asking about exemptions for sidewalks is and I think I mentioned this last time, I was working on a project that had curb tight sidewalks. And the design standard now is to make them property tight. And there's an exception, which is, well, if the sidewalk meets pro-ag standards. And for those of you who have never worked with those, the standards for making a sidewalk compliant with accessibly compliant is comically precise. It's almost an imaginary exact kind of slope that you'd have to hit. And this sidewalk, it was on a corner site. No one would walk on that sidewalk and think this is a person in a wheelchair or a walker wouldn't be able to use it. I mean, it seemed perfectly fine, but when you actually put the level on it and you are measuring it, they were slightly off around the whole property, or most of the property, I should say. And so then the answer came back that we had to remove the sidewalks and put them property tight since they didn't meet the development standards. And that was a huge cost to the project. And so it's things like that it would be nice. And I know it's difficult to have something in writing about exceptions, but when you have a sidewalk that pretty much anyone would walk on and be like, this is fine. If there is a way to not make the property kind of rip out a sidewalk and put in a new one or that kind of thing, I think that would be helpful for this type of development. I think it'd be helpful for all types of development, but I think this has a little added feature to it that might be able to push that through.
And Scott, I think there's some discretion we can kind of build in on our side, but just so the group knows, the reason why that is happening is because we were actually sued and had a federal judgment against us about dealing with this. And we do have advocates walking around, or at least we did in the past, with smart levels measuring sidewalks. So, and they were pulling tapes and doing levels, and that's how this all got started, right? And so that's why, Scott, we went to that level. But I do think, especially in terms of a shelter, if there's an existing sidewalk in front of them, we probably just stop the analysis there, right? And when we have other types of development, redevelopment, then these questions come in. But I think we can work with existing condition scenarios, especially with the intent of what we're trying to do with temporary shelters and things like that. You know, how we actually get that in code is another question, but I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, if it's buckling from a tree root,
yeah,
and then that's one thing. But if just that time of the year, freeze thaw, the sidewalk just slightly shifts one way, and then all of a sudden you have to, you're spending $40,000 to replace all the sidewalks.
So I guess, you guys, you're listening to two architects who have dealt with a lot of real world crap that we have to put up with. And it can be very frustrating. And so if we're bringing up issues that you think, why are they talking about that? It's an experiential thing that we've we think could happen. So
You're on mute, Mary.
So the question for me for code drafting, and I completely hear you both. I have, believe me, I have been there and was quite involved in the litigation. And the idea of having to take out and replace existing sidewalks and adding to the cost of a proposed shelter is not what we're looking at, and how we could accommodate that concern in the code drafting. I'm completely willing to look at where I had concerns with the financial hardship was more about no sidewalks and exempting out what seemed really part of the community's concern is that we would allow substandard. I mean, to me, it seemed like an equity issue. Like, why would we allow substandard buildings with no sidewalks for a community that needs them, and put that right in the code and have what is not nice development for a group of constituents of ours? And that, first, we do not like to waive public infrastructure. That is something we as the legal team have advised against regularly. If the council wants to waive infrastructure, we need to pay for it as a government. And I would say in this case, even more so, because this is a constituency that should have good infrastructure. So that's why our proposal is, if this is what council wants to do, then the city, we should be paying for it and have a mechanism. That's a different question than saying if there is existing infrastructure, we need more flexibility in saying we're not going to make the developer redo it for a minor failure to comply with PROAG.
Yeah.
To me, that's a completely different question. So I think we could make sure that the code we're drafting has some flexibility. I think, but what we're asking you about, rather than saying let's waive it and not have anything and have a potential site with nothing when it comes to sidewalks, our recommendation is that we find a way to fund it. And we even talked about timing, if that there would be a way. That's why we talked about a program where potentially we could have the development move forward if there was a way for it to be part of the city's sidewalk program for building it. That this is kind of still to be determined, but that we don't want to hold up something that's moving forward where we can still do the permit approval. Almost, we didn't want to call it like bonding, because that's kind of a different concept, but it's, if you're familiar with development, you know the concept where we could do the development approval even if the infrastructure wasn't yet built, if it's part of the city's program. So that was kind of what we were tossing around internally.
I think the direction, I guess, from the sounding board, kind of going back to what Mary's saying, is, do you agree that we should have some type of pedestrian facility to these temporary shelters within the right of way? The answer to that is yes. Then we can bring those other concerns and funding questions and work on those as staff. But it's that I guess it's that basic fundamental question. Their sidewalk to their front door or an asphalt path to the front door, or should that be continued, at least from a public improvement side, to these temporary shelters?
So Ross, you said one thing, and I know Barb's got her hand up and so is Pauline, but you said temporary shelters. And I think we were thinking that temporary shelters, the ones that are 180 days, wouldn't have to.
No, I'm sorry.
So, yeah,
permanent shelters.
I know it's hard.
Yeah.
Okay, so the ones more than 180 days. Yeah.
Yes. Sorry about that.
Barb, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think it is true that council knows we need a sidewalk program. Part of the sidewalk program is we need a sidewalk fund for these gaps citywide. And it seems like this is something that could go into that larger thing. Once we've established that program and that fund, we can then write within that the fund can be used to help with things like this.
Okay, great, thanks. And that's the direction in the TSP as well, that we do that. Okay, Pauline.
Just for clarification, I know we're really focusing on sidewalks, but when we talk about public improvements, it's all transportation improvements and water and sewer. So to draft the code and make a recommendation. I'll make clarification on that.
Yeah, so I guess I'll throw something out there. It's kind of what the staff recommending is. So we kind of maintain the MDS, the minimum development standards for sidewalks, for sidewalk construction. We would remove the requirement if you have a full street to your frontage that you need to build curb and asphalt through your property, to and through your property. We would remove that for shelters. And then if the desire is that you want to have water and sewer utilities to you, if you do not have those available to your property line and you want to extend service to you, you would at least need to hold to city public work standards to get the utility to your property, but we will not require you to push it all the way through. Trying to summarize it, that's kind of where we're heading. And if we can get some head nods or if there's disagreement with that, we can still draft that in the code, but that's kind of our thoughts.
I see people nodding their heads generally.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Does anyone else have any discussion on that? Russ and Pauline and Colin, do you feel like we've got what we were looking for?
Yeah, you know, I do think that we will work with council on that sidewalk program and the funding. You know, that's not really a code thing, but that's kind of goes hand in hand with the code to try to figure out a way to build it.
Okay. So do we need a vote on that recommendation, Elizabeth?
Sure. So I think Russ just summarized. If somebody wants to move what Russ summarized or make your own motion if you want to.
I motion to vote on Russ's recommendation.
Good. Anyone?
Second.
Great, Barb. Okay. Maybe we could just get a show of hands this time instead of going around. Okay. I think I see everyone. Thumbs up. Okay. Scott, was your thumb up? Okay. It was, yeah, great. Okay, it was off the screen. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. So I just wanted to, thanks for staying long and everything. And I just wanted to, I'm going to go back to screen share really quick. We've, because we're going to take a little more time and we thought this would be the case with the overlay districts and the master plan work that we need to do, the outreach and everything. We are going to bump planning commission. The work session was going to be January 10th. So we're bumping that to the 24th. So we have time to do that outside of the holidays. And then the planning commission hearing will either be February 7th or 24th. And then council will be after that. So that's the schedule revision. So let me go back here. So we'll be doing more outreach and updating our websites and everything to reflect that. I think we actually already have. So, and we'll send you out a revised code after Pauline gets a chance to make all the changes and everything. So, okay. Anyone have anything else for the good of the order? No. Pauline.
Thank you. Just thank you for asking for our opinions. It's really very appreciated.
Sure.
There is a hand raised in the attendees. I didn't know if, because they've held on for so long, I don't know if there is any interest in engaging with public comments at this point. I just wanted to bring it to the group's attention.
Yeah, it looks like we have a hand raised from Lloyd Gibson. Lloyd, okay, I'm having some issues with my Zoom. So Lloyd, I'm going to transfer you over as a panelist. There you are. You can go ahead and speak to the sounding board.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. I am a Russian. I infiltrate you. I am the fastest thing alive. More faster than.
Cut her out. Get her out.
Wow. Okay, that was exciting. Okay.
That was my first one of those.
Me too.
Me too.
Yeah, that was awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
Fastest thing alive.
that was really weird. Okay. Well, Megan, do you want You want to close?
I'll
with
let Lloyd
everything?
speak for all of us. No, no, thank you for today. Thank you for today and for coming back and getting into somewhat the weeds, but with a good outcome. And looking forward to the public outreach and bringing all this to the Planning Commission in January. So thanks for all your hard work.
I have a question. Susanna, when you say we will be bringing this back to Planning Commission in January, you're not talking about yourself there, are you?
Yeah, no, so I'm taking a new job in January for Barney and Worth. Yeah, leaving new things after 6 or so years with the city. So, but I'm going to be coming back to help Pauline on a contract. So I'll be around to finish out this project, but I'll be as a consultant or whatever on this. So, and starting to work on other things with Barney and Worth. So, yeah. So I'll sort of be around.
I think you can be really proud of yourself, Susanna.
Oh,
this is the last project. I think it's really so important, and we appreciate you so much. And we're just gonna miss you.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Barb. I'm gonna miss everything too, but I'll be around. So
Okay,
yeah,
good.
yeah. You might be like, oh, I wish she was gone for good. Anyhow, yeah. It's been good. I'm just, yeah. New stuff. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Susanna, for all your hard work on this.
Yeah, well, it's a team effort as shown today. I could barely talk. So anyway, yeah. All right. Well, if we don't see you, have a great holiday. And yeah, we'll be in touch after the first of the year and send some stuff out ahead of time, the draft code, once we have that updated and stuff. So thanks, everyone. Okay.
Move to adjourn.
Great.